Welcome to the Heritage Foundation. I'm Dr. Stephen Bucci. I'm the director of the Allison Center, which is part of the Davis Institute. We're the folks who do foreign policy for heritage, and specifically in this case with Russia and Eurasia. This is a great crowd for a day like today. I'm thrilled. I'm going to introduce our speakers very quickly because you can see we have a lot of them, and we'll get through this time. And I will, before I do that, I will tell you we will do Q&A. I have to dash out because Syria is still going on, and I'm needed elsewhere as we get on. I'm going to stay as long as I can. And Dr. Cohen is going to pick up the moderation piece for the Q&A. But he asked me to give my standard line to everyone when I do these, and that when we get to the Q&A, we have microphones available. Raise your hand. You'll be recognized. When you get the microphone, stand up, identify yourself, please, and then ask a question. All right? If at the end of 2 sentences there is not a question mark popping up, you will be asked to sit down, because we've got a lot of folks here, a lot of expertise on this particular subject area, and there's a lot of interest in Russia right now, and we want to give the speakers as much time as possible. Our first speaker today is going to be Dr. Evelyn Farkas. Dr. Farkas is the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Russia, Ukraine, and Eurasia in the Department of Defense. She is formerly the Senior Advisor to the Supreme Allied Commander Europe, my good friend Jim, and has served in a wealth of other positions around Washington. She is a true treasure to get for this. We were thrilled when you said yes, and glad you could join us. She will be followed by Dr. Don Jensen, who is the resident fellow at the Center for Transatlantic Relations at SAIS, Johns Hopkins University. He is a former Foreign Service officer who spent a good deal of time in Moscow and understands the target country that we're going to be discussing very well. Then we'll have Kyle Parker, who is the Policy Advisor for Eurasia at the Commission on Security and Cooperation in Europe. He will be followed by our colleague here at Heritage, Jim Roberts, who is also a former Foreign Service officer, and he is one of our economic experts here at Heritage, and he's going to be touching specifically on the G-20 and the effect of that. And then our cleanup hitter, who does not play baseball, as we found out when we went to a Nats game with him, will be Dr. Ariel Cohen, who is our expert on Russia here at Heritage, and he will be the final speaker, and then he will take over the moderation duties at that time. So to get me off and get the experts on, we'll start with Dr. Farkas, and you can come up to the podium or you can speak from your chair, whichever you prefer.
Okay. Thank you very much, Steve. Thank you, Ariel. Dr. Cohen, Ariel asked me to speak at the podium, so I will do that, with apologies for sounding very formal. But it is truly a pleasure to be back here at Heritage. I've had the opportunity over the years that I've spent here in Washington, working on the Hill, working for Congressional Commission, to actually speak to Heritage audiences, and I welcome the opportunity, and I'm grateful that you guys have decided to have me come back. So thank you again. And I also look forward to hearing the comments and the questions from the audience today. I know you have a very large and distinguished group of participants today, so I'm also happy to be able to engage with all of you. I'm speaking today to you as a representative of the Department of Defense, specifically from the Office of the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy. Our office is responsible for policy vis-à-vis Russia, Ukraine, Eurasia, as well as the Western Balkans and conventional arms control. In my remarks today, what I'll do is provide an overview of the U.S. Russia security and defense relationship, including some comments, a little bit of information about the bilateral meeting that Secretary Hagel and Russian Defense Minister Shoigu had recently. I'll then describe some of what we see as the key challenges and opportunities ahead in U.S.-Russia relations, and then, of course, leave ample time for discussion. and of course, our panelists will also help with that. Essentially, as many of you know, President Obama came into office making very clear that he is committed to finding ways to work with Russia when it is in the United States' strategic interest. The bilateral defense relationship is one of the areas where we have made some progress since 2009. In the last 4 years, we've achieved tangible results by cooperating in areas of mutual interest, and we've produced real tangible benefits for the American and Russian people. What do I mean by that? We have successfully negotiated and implemented a New START treaty. We've supported Russia's WTO membership and adopted tough multilateral sanctions on North Korea and Iran, which of course were against their nuclear weapons programs. We've implemented the 123 agreement, which enables both countries to develop proliferation-resistant technology, and we work together on stabilizing Afghanistan. And I'll talk a little bit more about these as we go along. However, as all of us here in this auditorium know, the U.S. Russia relationship has been marked by cyclical ups and downs. And over the past year, while we've tried to engage Moscow at a high level to jumpstart discussions on missile defense and growing bilateral trade and investment topics, among other issues, and we have continued to work with Russia to find mutually acceptable solutions. We've been managing, at the same time, a significant disagreement with the Russians over Syria, and then, of course, came the Snowden affair. For all these reasons, we determined that it would be more constructive to postpone the planned presidential summit until we have more results from our shared agenda. And part of that, of course, is my mandate in the defense lane. So having said that, we will continue to engage the Russian government to try to find common ground on these and other issues, even as we continue to speak out about our concerns. Now, our defense engagement objectives with Russia remain consistent. We aim to further U.S. interests, to build confidence both bilaterally and multilaterally, and to bolster transparency in our defense and security relations. We continue to seek cooperation with Russia on 3 issues where we believe we have common interests. One is counterproliferation, so that's dealing with Iran, North Korea, and in regions adjacent to the Russian Federation. 2 is counterterrorism, and the 3rd one is on counter-narcotics. Our level of interaction with Russia has increased substantially with the establishment of the Defense Relations Working Group in September of 2010, which is under the auspices of the U.S. Russia Bilateral Presidential Commission. It's currently co-chaired by Secretary Hagel and Defense Minister Shoigu. The working group is intended to create mechanisms for discussion and engagement at the policy level between defense professionals on a range of issues, some of which I mentioned before, but they include defense reform and modernization, missile defense cooperation, defense technology cooperation, and global and regional security issues of mutual interest. The increased U.S. focus on improving bilateral relationship has seen progress on a wide array of issues. First is Afghanistan. I mentioned it before and said I would go into it a little bit more in detail. We have been working together with the Russians on improving stability in Afghanistan because we believe it is, again, a shared interest. And Russia continues to be supportive by expanding the northern distribution network and allowing for diversification in the types of cargo that can pass through its territory. Bilateral and NATO-Russia Council arrangements to support ground and air transit into and out of Afghanistan have resulted in thousands of overflights, hundreds of thousands of military personnel, and tens of thousands of containers of cargo having been transported through Russia to support operations in Afghanistan. The U.S. and Russia continue to work together to disrupt al-Qaeda and other terrorist groups' operational networks and to undermine their access to financial resources. Along with these bilateral efforts, we also have the NATO-Russia cooperation channel, where we've seen an expansion of the NATO-Russia Council's counter-narcotics program in Central Asia, which targets the flow of narcotics from Afghanistan. The NATO-Russia Council counter-narcotics program has trained more than 2,000 law enforcement officers from Central Asia, Afghanistan, and Pakistan since 2006. We are also working on developing common methods to combat piracy off the Horn of Africa. within the auspices of the NATO-Russia Council. And more generally, we are seeking to enhance military transparency via regular exchanges in the NATO-Russia Council fora. Several initiatives undertaken by the Defense Relations sub-working groups. I have mentioned the overall working group, and it contains several sub-working groups. Several initiatives that have been undertaken by these working groups have the potential to advance the defense and security relations between our countries. First of all, we have what's known as the Global Regional Security Sub-Working Group. Some of these names are long and awkward, but we shorten it to Global Regional. The Global Regional Group, it provides a venue for regular and routinized discussion, sharing perspectives, very open and honest perspectives actually, on a wide variety of global and regional issues of mutual interest, such as Asia-Pacific security, Afghanistan, NATO-Russia cooperation, conventional arms control, Europe, and the Korean Peninsula. So it's kind of a basket where we can discuss any kind of global issues and regional ones, of course. Second, the Training, Education, and Human Resources Work Group. As you would imagine, this is where you can talk about nuts and bolts of policies and exchange information on best practices. And we have done so when it comes to military training, education, and we've explored a midshipman cadet exchange program between the two countries within the auspices of that working group. The most recent meeting that happened at the highest level between the ministers, as I mentioned earlier, was on the sidelines of the 2+2 meeting on August 9, 2003. And that was the first meeting as well between these particular ministers, between Secretary Hagel and Minister Shoigu. During the meeting, they agreed to have a more robust agenda for defense and military-to-military engagement, which includes improved information sharing, military exchanges, and joint exercises and training. Minister Shoigu also extended invitations for the United States military delegation to attend the large-scale Russia-Belarus exercise, Zapad 2013, which will happen in the fall, and for the U.S. team to participate in a tank biathlon in 2014. So it's kind of something new, and Secretary Hagel warmly accepted. Their discussion also covered cooperation on counterterrorism, supporting security and stability in post-2014 Afghanistan, and the importance of pursuing a political process to end violence in Syria. Now, although, as I mentioned, there has been significant convergence on many issues and we've made progress over the last several years, there also remain, I have to be honest, significant challenges in our relationship. And 4 of these are most apparent, so I'll just lay them out now, and then I'm sure we'll have good discussion about them. One is Syria. Second are the regional issues. Third, missile defense. And fourth, strategic stability. So first, with regard to Syria, as we all in the room are very well aware, the U.S. and Russia have deep concerns. We share deep concerns about the situation, but we have different views on the resolution. We both concur on the necessity to end the violence. However, Russia's support to President Assad's regime and subsequent weapons deliveries are at a stark disagreement with President Obama's views on Syria. It is in the interest, however, of both the United States and Russia to facilitate an end to this conflict, and both of our countries have been adamant that we remain committed to working with each other to bring the parties together to negotiate a political settlement. Second, Russia's continued occupation of Georgian territories and diplomatic recognition of them as independent states remains a serious concern. This situation only worsens security and constrains economic development in the region. We must continue to hold Russia to the letter of the 6-point agreement and urge it to cease efforts to construct physical barriers on the administrative boundary lines. We must urge Russia to allow humanitarian access to the occupied territories and to permit the European Union monitoring mission to fulfill its mandate on both sides of the ABLs as well as to address Russia's unwanted military presence in Moldova. While this is more modest in scope as compared to our concerns or the situation in Georgia, the situation in Moldova continues to be a concern to the United States government. Third, Russia continues to express concern that the U.S. and NATO missile defenses could pose a threat to Russia's strategic deterrent. They also question whether Iran poses a threat to NATO and thus have questioned whether a missile defense to protect NATO allies is necessary. They have also stated that the only way to dispel Russia's concerns is through legally binding restrictions on U.S. and NATO missile defenses, something the United States cannot accept. We continue to assure Russia that our missile defense efforts are not directed against Russia, nor do they pose a threat to its strategic deterrent. And we continue to make the case that the transparency and cooperation we are offering provide the best way for Russia to gain the confidence it seeks that our missile defenses do not threaten Russia's strategic deterrent. Fourth, the United States and Russia continue to engage in a broad dialogue about strategic stability issues, including further nuclear reductions. The President has made clear his intent to pursue further reductions in U.S. and Russian nuclear stockpiles. But Moscow remains hesitant to engage on this topic, citing the need for a project on other strategic stability issues, including the aforementioned missile defense, conventional prompt global strike, space, etc. We have made clear our willingness to discuss the full range of strategic stability issues of concern to both countries, and we will continue to seek opportunities to make progress on this agenda. So to wrap up, let me emphasize again that the sphere of U.S. Russia defense cooperation, it presents many challenges, but also holds many strategic opportunities. And as we look for opportunities to cooperate with Russia, we will need to work together to confront some enduring challenges. We will continue raising the topics of missile defense, conventional arms control in Europe, support to Syrian government, and enhanced military transparency during our talks with Russian leadership. We will also maintain our position on human rights and democracy in our dialogue with Moscow and our engagement on human rights and other issues at the OSCE, and pursue programs, including anti-corruption initiatives and professional and academic exchanges that promote the rule of law and civil society. Although there have been highs and lows in our relationship with Russia, the defense dialogue between the two countries continues, and there is reason to be somewhat sanguine. I've covered a lot of ground this afternoon, and I know we have many other experts who have important ideas that they want to convey and contributions they want to make to the discussion. So I will wrap up now, and with a thanks again for giving me the time to give the administration's DoD position on our relationship with Russia. Thanks.
Good morning. Thanks to Ariel and Our Heritage in General for hosting this very interesting event. It's always a pleasure to come back. So as a well-known Alaskan politician might say, so how's that reset working out for you? And the answer, of course, is it's either dead or on life support, and has been for a long period of time, I think. How do we know this? Because everywhere you look around Washington and around the pundit world, you've got a series of kind of self-serving, almost cliches. Well, things were at an irredeemably low point in 2008. We had, and a reset helped improve the atmosphere. If you saw Peter Baker's very interesting article in the Times yesterday, he said, well, at the working level, they were always skeptical about the reset, but it's the big time guys at the top who made policy that were more enthusiastic. It goes on and on and on. Obama tried it for a while and it didn't work out, and so forth and so forth. And when you start to see spin, that means the story is pretty much over. These people are well-intentioned. The reset in many ways was carefully crafted, but the problems, I think, and I'll talk primarily about domestic politics, are much deeper. And we have to ask ourselves as we go forward, and I was heartened by Dr. Farkas's comments, because I do favor engagement of a different sort. It's important, I think, to look at why the reset reached, as President Obama said in his remarks in Sweden this morning, a brick wall. Now, in fact, there were many achievements, some of which I'm less enthusiastic about than others. Dr. Farkas mentioned them: START, Afghanistan, counterproliferation, and so forth and so forth. I would argue, however, that they were largely oversold, especially the benefits of the START treaty. Some would have happened on their own under a different administration, different policy. And third, when they were successful, for example, our cooperation on Afghanistan, they were largely in Russia's interests as well. But in any case, the moral cost to the United States, I think, has been very high. We have I think, for the time being, lost the moral alliance we had with the Russian democratic opposition. Second, I think the reset has been contradictory, but has also suggested that America is less is weak and indecisive. And third, I would add as a footnote in passing that it disturbed me to see that the cancellation of the summit this month, which I supported, was not due to concerns about Putin's crackdown or human rights at home. It was due to more geopolitical considerations. And I think that reflects a general tone deafness, not universally the case in the administration, but general about the secondary role of human rights concerns in democratization inside Russia. So why has it declined? Well, there are a number of reasons. Why has the reset come to a brick wall? There are a number of reasons, one of which I think is both sides saw its benefits and the possibilities of cooperation differently. Some of you in this room, I know, were at Minister Lavrov's speech at Carnegie about 3 years ago, very, very clearly said it's the role of the reset to restore and make amends for the mistakes that the Bush administration and the Clinton administration have made over the past 20 years. That, of course, is quite a bit different than we looked at it. Second, I think the reset, by its focus on Russia, reflected the Cold War mentality on both sides. It encouraged the Russian delusion that Russia was a great power on a par with the U.S., and it implicitly gave, as Dr. Farkas said, it implicitly gave, and I use an example what Dr. Farkas said about Georgia, it gave Moscow the sense that it had a privileged position in the former Soviet Union in particular, as well as in other areas. I mentioned not only Georgia, but Ukraine. There are other things always cited, lack of personal chemistry, no economic ties, and so forth and so forth. But again, I wanted to make a few points about Russian domestic politics, because I think in many ways that was the key driver for the end of the reset. And to some extent, we set ourselves up for disappointment. Point one is that I think the unwillingness of the administration to practice linkage, which is to say marry cooperation with concern, meaningful, and I emphasize meaningful engagement on human rights, was an ultimately fatal contradiction to the policy once the domestic situation in Russia went backward. Second, I would say that the U.S. bet on Medvedev, very much misleading and misreading the Russian domestic situation. And we put our money on a long shot at best, and we were wrong, and now we had no plan B. And now Putin, I think, has not forgotten that people like Biden, the vice president, were seen to have encouraged his presidential ambitions, even if it didn't happen. Even if we didn't literally do that, they were seen to do that. Third, once the Putin crackdown began, we were at the mercy, or a hostage, I would say, of the reset, which is to say we had enough invested in some bilateral issues, especially on security, to make it was unwilling to support and protest the crackdown and support the Russian democratic opposition to the extent that we might otherwise have done so. And relatedly, and finally on the issues of the causes of the end of the reset, Putin again and again has engaged in absolutely vicious anti-American rhetoric, absolutely trying to demonize the West in particular, as a way to justify the crackdown at home. We largely, for the first few months of this, and that means since Putin returned at the end of 2000, or we knew he'd returned, but especially since the elections at the end of 2011, we protested, Secretary Clinton in particular did, but in general, Putin demonized the U.S. as a way to justify his crackdown at home. We were then hostage of the reset, didn't want to abandon it until really pushed, and that, unfortunately, I think, happened far too late. This is most exemplified in Syria, where a key element, in my view, of what the Russian position has been a nervousness about the role of Western foreign intervention to undermine authoritarian regimes. We saw that with Ukraine and the Orange Revolution. We saw that elsewhere as well. But ultimately, I think the Russians want to are nervous themselves about the stability of their own regime, certainly after the street protests last year. And I think that concern about Russia's domestic situation has driven, to a significant extent, Russia's obstinacy on Syria. So where is all this going? I think and very much hope that we do continue at the working level, as the President said, to continue to work together on those issues which Dr. Farkas has pointed out: security, terrorism, counterproliferation, and so forth. But I think it's high time for the U.S. to once again re-engage the moral dimension of our foreign policy with Russia, which is to say a more active promotion of human rights, a more active realization that the tie between money and power, which is essential to the Russian regime in international corporations such as Gazprom, that's a central way in which we can push back and advance America's agenda, and finally to more emphatically engage those elements of the Russian opposition which have been alienated by the reset, in terms of working with them to promote peaceful, orderly change inside Russia and the development of what we all seek, which is a rule of law state. My final point would be that the issue of democracy and Russia's domestic politics is itself an issue of that's important in bilateral relations. It's not external to it. Too often in the past 4 or 5 years, we've seen it as an annoyance, seen it as something that's not as important as this or that other agreement. And my point is that it affects and shapes Russia's behavior, not only at home, but overseas as well. And I think we have to marry that, we have to link those back up, those elements that were separated, unfortunately, by reset in 2009, to be more effective dealing with Russia and where it's going in the next few years.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, and thank you, Ariel, for the invitation to be here. I'm pleased to have the opportunity to join such a distinguished panel and say a few words about human rights in the context of our relationship with Russia. Before beginning, I just add the usual disclaimer that my remarks are just my remarks, nothing official. Working as I do for Democrats and Republicans, senators and representatives, it's occasionally a challenge to find a common ground worth defending that isn't so plain and obvious as to need no defense. I would like to, I guess, pick up where you, Don, left off and speak to the moral dimension, which is what I focus on at the Helsinki Commission. We are chartered by Congress to focus primarily on the third dimension of the Helsinki process, which is, of course, human rights, although we do spend some time looking at security and economic commercial dimensions as well. And so that is where I would like to begin and speak to a few things we could do. At the outset, I guess I would like to start where most presentations end, which is concretely what can we do different. One of the topics in the write-up was how can we support our friends in Russia, and I think there are a few things concretely we can do better. To do that, they don't cost a whole lot, and there are things that to greater or lesser degrees we're already doing anyway. First and foremost, I would sort of chalk this one up under the realm of speaking more directly, being more candid, more concrete. I think we've seen a little bit more of that in recent days. I hope it will continue. Mainstreaming human rights and emphasizing them at the highest level. These rights are, of course, not reducible to another item on a long list to be raised with the Russians. The Russians get used to that, and they get used to discounting that. They really should inform all aspects of our relationship with Russia, or certainly any other country. These fundamental freedoms are not only American values, they're universal principles. They bind all states. They're enshrined in domestic laws and international commitments. Our promotion of the rule of law, human rights, and democratic governance cannot be credibly dismissed as interference in internal affairs. This is basically settled law in organizations like the OSCE, but it's worth repeating given how often we hear the Russian Foreign Ministry attempt to dismiss U.S. interventions in this sphere as so much meddling. Perfection, of course, won't be achieved, but it never is anyway, and there's plenty of good to do along the way. Also, results may not happen immediately, nor will they always lend themselves to convenient metrics that we may use to measure policy successes in other areas of tangible deliverables. That said, keeping faith with those who peacefully seek to exercise their rights and suffer for doing so isn't a small thing. And this moral solidarity, if you will, belongs on any balance sheet, as it's a powerful force for change, especially in authoritarian states. And I think the simpler, more sincere and concrete we can make these statements, so much the better. It really isn't that complicated. It's not a big political game. It comes down to commitments that were freely undertaken. Are they kept or are they broken? To do it in good times and in bad, and with friends and with foes, also sort of, I think, reinforces our sincerity and so much helps to disarm a notion that America uses human rights as a club to bash states into compliance on other issues, but it's not something we really care about. So to avoid that cynicism, and also to make it really as concrete as possible. The name and the face can never really be a distraction from the greater issue. It really is the issue itself. This is where we see implementation gained or lost. Now, most of what I'm speaking about here will be a task for the administration, and I hope the President will continue his newfound directness toward Russia, and tomorrow's meeting with civil society leaders in St. Petersburg presents a timely opportunity to carry an unambiguous message from the very top to the Russian street. Another natural area for growth is a continued and more comprehensive implementation of the Magnitsky Act. This largely falls to the administration, but Congress has an oversight role, and given past reluctance, will likely need to exercise this role along with human rights groups to ensure that this new tool is used as it was intended and doesn't become merely another irritant in relations, seemingly spoiling things without achieving much. The initial targeting from last April was a serious first step, but more needs to be done to satisfy what is no longer a political proposal, but the law of the land. We should strive for purity of intent here and resist the sloth of having recourse to an existing tool as a means of punishing Russia for Snowden or really for anything else. The Magnitsky Act is a pro-Russian law in that it targets individuals who murder, torture, and steal from the Russian people. As to expanding the list, senior administration officials agree and have given their word on multiple occasions that this is a process and not an event, and that more names will be added. While the Magnitsky Act doesn't aim to be a comprehensive strategy, it's the least we can do to ensure that our own country and banking system doesn't become an inadvertent haven for kleptocrats and human rights abusers, and it's a cost-effective way to show support for those in Russia who suffer at the hands of such rogues. The initial report on the implementation of the Act is due in December and calls on the administration to explain what it is doing to encourage others to adopt similar measures. Perhaps someone else knows more, but I'm not aware of much encouragement coming from Washington on this particularly, and in Europe there are numerous initiatives that could benefit from our support. I trust the administration will give this some thought before their first report to Congress this year. Finally, we can throw a lifeline to a Russian civil society under siege by supporting them with more than lofty rhetoric. The liquidation of the U.S. Russia investment fund has yet to be completed, and a congressional notification envisioning substantial assistance to Russian NGOs languishes in Congress. And just to be clear, this is not new money, but money that's been allocated for a number of years. While the Foreign Agents Law and the expulsion of USAID have made it more challenging to extend such assistance, these factors have far from made it impossible, and the USG knows how to support those on the ground in harsher environments than what currently prevail in Russia. Getting the TUSRF funds unstuck soon will send more than a message that the United States is prepared to stick by those who've been unfairly and frighteningly smeared with the label of traitor. Before concluding, and I'll do that soon so we can get to Q&A, I'd just like to note a few reasons that I see for some optimism in what is largely a dark space. First and foremost is the newfound civic awareness that transcends the capitals of Moscow and St. Petersburg. We see this in the current election campaign going on not only in Moscow, but Yekaterinburg and other regions. This sentiment may not have appeared to have changed much in the system in recent years. Nonetheless, it's new, it's perceptible, and it will change Russia for the better in the years ahead. Second, the Winter Olympics in Sochi present a valuable opportunity to educate the American public on the nature and character of Russia's government and to involve more people here in the discussion on what is to be done as we take this pause and reevaluate the relationship. And third, it seems the administration is beginning a rethink on the framework of the U.S.-Russian relationship. And this presents a moment to do a little house cleaning and discard what might not be working so well. The new team, many of whom are still in vetting and confirmation process, are more than up to the task of rethinking our relations, and particularly reasserting our government's perennial concerns for liberty and democracy. With that, I'll conclude and look forward to any questions.
Thank you, Kyle. Jim? Economic standpoint.
Thank you. Just a couple minutes on the G20 agenda that the leaders will be looking at in St. Petersburg. Since the G20 was elevated from finance minister level meeting to head of state summit during the 2008 financial crisis, economic conditions in the G20 have generally stagnated or deteriorated. The average GDP in G20 is under 2%, closer to 1.5. Unemployment is nearly 10% average. And debt, sovereign debt in the G20 countries average about 2/3 of GDP. So bleak conditions continue to face the heads of state. Now, to be sure, they will be discussing the desirability of more structural economic reforms. They will restate their commitment to a free and open global trading system. They will oppose protectionist measures and competitive exchange rate devaluations. Nevertheless, we've been looking at the agenda and the lead up to it, and we see many kind of government-centric issues that tend to have a higher profile at these meetings. Buzzwords such as financial safety nets, rebalancing global demand, global infrastructure gaps, financial inclusion, financial literacy, money laundering, energy sustainability, even global marine environmental protection. All these are issues, and the agenda for the G20 has become cluttered. Now, it may be disappointing to the civil servants, senior civil servants from the G20 countries that always use these occasions as opportunities to get blessings by their bosses, by the head of state for the efforts that their particular agencies or regulatory bodies are doing. We think it's time to slim down the agenda. As it is, 19 countries in the European Union barely have enough time really for opening statements and photo ops at these meetings. So leave these tangential issues to lower level experts. Don't elevate them and clutter up this agenda. And get back to the business at hand of getting the whole world back on a path toward stronger and healthy economic growth. How do you do that? Well, we just happen to have the answer here. Our recently published Global Agenda for Economic Freedom, which we think would be a fine thing for the G20 to adopt as their agenda, and copies of it are available. It focuses on tackling entitlements in all the G20 countries, on reducing debt that is being driven by these entitlements largely, fighting corruption, reducing the role of state-owned enterprises, especially in China and elsewhere, strengthening property rights, increasing global trade, private sector-led global trade and investment. And we will be issuing what we call an issue brief on this later today that you can get online. So I think I'll just stop there and look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Okay, clean up hitter. Colin?
Thank you very much, Dr. Bucci. Thank you very much, Dr. Farkas. And thank you, you all, for coming here today. Thank you for the panelists, especially those who keep coming back. This is great. I initially was thinking about the Snowden affair, and it's in the title when we started planning this. But boy, oh boy, things are being overtaken by events, even 2 days after Labor Day. I think Snowden and Syria are indicative of where the relationship is. But in the bustle of news, I think it behooves us to take a step back and look at what is really going on in the last 12 or 13 years in Russia, put it in context, and then it helps you to understand policy, understand the events, understand the reactions, the moves of the other side, and then develop policy. And I believe that what's happening today is the return of an ideological and neo-imperial state in Russia. Ideological and neo-imperial. Why? Because after the collapse of the Soviet Union, there was a lot of talk in Russia of what is a national idea. And there were task forces and people were, sent to dachas to come up with drafts, and nothing ever happened from it. But when you look at Russian sources today, at television, at social media, at publications, you find a process. It's not a done deal yet, but a process of crystallization of new ideology. And that ideology is anti-Western, it is Russocentric, it is Eurasianist, Eurasia-centric, it's anti-democratic, it's anti-human rights, and it's anti-American. And I can give you chapter, verse, quote after quote of all of the above, of anti-Americanism, in the films, in the speeches, in TV, tons of it on NTV, and in other sources that form the outlook. So there is a, what the Russians would call a social order, a social request of this anti-Western, anti-American ideology. The leading spokespeople are such dinosaurs from the Soviet times, like Alexander Prokhanov, such neo-fascist or extreme European New Right ideologues like Dugin, economists who are statists and left-wing, people like Sergei Glazyev, who, by the way, is the co-author of a new strategy of how to force Ukraine into the customs union, something that we analyzed here and hopefully will publish here. So this is the first issue that it is an ideological, quasi-imperial and integrationist, post-Soviet integrationist, more or less, give or take, in the borders of the Soviet Union minus the Baltic states, not the Romanov Empire, because they gave up on Poland, they gave up on Finland. Thank you very much. There are some people on the fringes who talk about Alaska. Good luck. But if you look at the process that we are witnessing with the forcing countries like Ukraine, like Armenia, who just gave its agreement to join the customs union, and the plans for 2015 Eurasian Economic Union, and then people like Glazyev, key players, are saying, for now, these are only economic structures. But these are economic structures that explicitly, clearly forbid these countries to develop their ties with Western Europe, with the European Union, to develop independent relationships with NATO and with the United States. So this is creation of what Dmitry Medvedev, the person on whom the Obama administration has put bets in 09, 10, and 11, said, this is our Russian sphere of privileged interests, the former Soviet Union. So the emergence of such a country, such a state, in the heart of Eurasia changes the geopolitical dynamics and geopolitical balance. It changes how that state looks at the United States. So to say the least, to be soft and kind here, it's competition, and it is a hardball competition, as the case of Mr. Snowden demonstrates. Mr. Snowden, it turns out, and I'm pretty sure everybody here noticed that, didn't just happen to be in Sheremetyevo on his transit flight to wherever he was saying he was going, Ecuador or whatever. He went to the Russian mission. No, it's not an embassy in Hong Kong because the embassy is in Beijing. But he went to the Russian mission, and according to the publication in the Kommersant, spent there 2 or 3 days. What was he talking about these 2 or 3 days? I'm sure they were not discussing Chinese cuisine. And then he shows up in Moscow, and Mr. Putin says, well, we have to give him a political asylum, a temporary political asylum, provided he doesn't continue his leaks that harm the relationship with our American partners. That's what Putin said. What Snowden did, Snowden published, from what I know, 2 major things since. Probably the main one is the structure of the U.S. intelligence services, 16 intelligence services budget. Something that was classified, I have no idea what was the level of classification, but let me guess it was high. Second of all, Snowden just leaked, I think day before yesterday, maybe 2 days before, the fact that the United States was collecting actively on 2 heads of state, of Mexico and of Brazil. Now, the Mexicans and Brazilians probably guessed that they may be targets of some collection, maybe from Venezuela and Cuba, as well as other countries. Countries sort of do things like that. But the fact that it's leaked hurts our relationship. And I talked to a Brazilian reporter yesterday, and she told me that, yes, the Brazilians are pretty upset about this, and Brazil, of course, is not going to participate in the Syrian mission, if and when that happens. But the fact is, Snowden is continuing leaking information that is materially damaging to the United States, with the approval and support of those who control him now. So this is just apropos Snowden. The second issue was Syria in our priorities of discussion. And with Syria, it's pretty clear. First, Russia doesn't want any kind of humanitarian intervention or responsibility to protect, or anything that may appear as an attempt to change regimes in authoritarian countries. I talked to people in Moscow who told me that at the highest level there is a belief in Moscow that they may be next. I think it's ridiculous. I think it is, paranoid. But that's what people are telling me. I have no reason to question their judgment on that. Second, there's a long relationship between Russia and the Assad family, starting with Papa Assad, continuing with Baby Assad, and that relationship is multifaceted. Yes, it is weapons sales, but it's also the only anchorage the Russian Navy has in the Mediterranean today. They used to have anchorages or even port privileges in Egypt, in Libya, and in Syria, and today they don't. So when you read about the agenda of the Russian Navy, they would like to have some kind of facilities in the Mediterranean. They even mentioned the Socotra Island. For those of us with gray hair, we remember from the Cold War in the 80s in particular, the Socotra Island off the shores of Yemen, a strategic location in the entrance to Bab el-Mandeb, the entrance to the Red Sea. The Soviets had a naval facility there as well, et cetera, et cetera. So they're thinking in terms of themselves as a global naval power. Just to wrap it up on this ideology of a neo-imperial state, there is an outburst of sympathy towards the Syrian regime and toward Assad, up to including people in this highly influential ideological group that constituted itself as the Izborsky Klub, the Izborsky Club of Prokhanov, Dugin, etc., are saying that, quote, the battle for Damascus is the battle for Moscow. Well, if it is a battle for Moscow, I think these patriots should get on the next plane to Damascus and take Kalashnikovs in their hands and just go do the right thing. To address what my colleagues talked about, the internal human rights, anti-Western tendency, I would point out several things. One is that state control of television is very important. The majority of Russians still get their news from television, and the anti-American message on Russian state-controlled television is what is forming the public opinion. Second, social media, the fact that Facebook was invented in Silicon Valley or at Harvard doesn't mean that every Facebook page everywhere is pro-American. The anti-Western forces, anti-American forces are taking, are making full use of the social media, of Kontakte, of Facebook, of Twitter, you name it, they're there. Next, persecution of political opponents, starting with Alexei Navalny, who is allowed to run for the mayor of Moscow, but probably will never sit in the mayor's chair under this regime. Navalny was sentenced to 5 years in prison on trumped-up charges. As a former lawyer, I went over the materials that were published, and I saw that there was no criminal case. Maybe a civil case, maybe, but no criminal case against Alexei Navalny. Mikhail Khodorkovsky, same thing. Not only the man, in total disregard of double jeopardy, was persecuted twice on mutually exclusive charges, not only every change in the law that allowed thousands and tens of thousands of Russian business people unjustly persecuted to walk on presidential pardons, on change of law that allowed them not to serve sentences. No, they keep him in jail, and now we hear about the third Khodorkovsky case, which may lock him up for life on conspiracy, trumped-up conspiracy charges for what? For allegedly organizing experts to lobby the Russian Human Rights Committee under the presidency and other parts of the Russian government to shorten his jail term. That is a conspiracy under which they are trying to, or maybe trying to, present another case for Khodorkovsky. Otherwise, a year from now, he has to walk. In the meantime, some of the most prominent Russian experts, like Sergei Guriev, who advised the Medvedev presidency, who established probably the best Russian school of economics, had to flee for their life out of the country in order not to be dragged into prosecution. And finally, the package of laws that are clearly anti-Western. So this ideological state uses all its tools of state power, of soft power, of media, of legislation to target. Who are they targeting? They're targeting orphans who would save, whose life may be saved if they were adopted by American or other Western families. It's not only the ban or cancellation of adoptions into the United States, but any country that allows gay marriage or allows gays to adopt, they say we're not going to allow these Russian children to be adopted out of the country. It is targeting NGOs that may get Western and American support. It is draconian criminalization of alleged insults of religion belief, and those of us who hold the First Amendment dearly and care about freedom of the press and freedom of expression can realize how the Russian justice system in the state that it is can interpret what insult of belief, of religious belief may be. So what can the Obama administration do? What can Congress do? It is in the issue brief that was available here. I'm told that it's gone, but if you go online, it's an issue brief called Obama and the G-20 Summit, Time to Rethink U.S. Russian Relations, published August 29th. And just very briefly, and I'm not going to read all the policy recommendations, I'm suggesting let's start with a new blank sheet. Let's assemble a new interagency team, including, of course, Dr. Farkas, that is not burdened by failures of reset and will consist of professionals from State Department, Defense Department, intelligence community, outside experts, etc., to take a hard look in view of what we understand now about what's really going on in the Russian Federation, not what we would like to happen there without the rosy or pink or whatever you call them glasses. Second, I probably am too late with that because Obama is already, I think he's already said, no? He's on the way?
In Sweden.
He's in Sweden. Well, what we suggested is to deliver a speech on U.S. Russian relations, making very clear that U.S. is friendly to Russia, U.S. people is friendly to Russia. We're not seeking confrontation, and there's a lot of things we can cooperate on. Fight international terrorism, expand business, protect human rights, and expand democratic reforms. And there's also tons of potential fields and projects of cooperation in healthcare. Russian people on average live 20 years less than Americans. 20 years less. Why not use the knowledge and the skills of American healthcare system? I'm not talking about some financial and management issues. That's for my domestic policy colleagues to talk about. But the sheer knowledge and power of American healthcare. Education. The Russian high school students and university students, maybe with the exception of some top universities, are not doing so well in global comparison tests. So we can expand the ranks. I saw, since 2008, 200,000 foreign students came to the United States. 200,000, a lot of foreign students. 160,000 of them came from one country. It's not Russia, China, exactly. And how many Russian students? Ed, do you know how many Russian students came? I don't know, but not that many. Okay. Obama is doing what we published on the 29th of August, meet with a wide array of democratic opposition forces in St. Petersburg. Very good. Unfortunately, the doyen of Russian Human Rights Society, human rights community, Lyudmila Alexeyeva and Lev Ponomaryov and a couple of others did not meet with Obama because these organizers kept changing the time frame, or they maybe are not happy with other things. I have to look into that, don't know what happened there. Accelerate granting of licenses to build liquefied natural gas terminals to export American natural gas to Europe, sending Kremlin a clear message that foreign intransigence and domestic oppression comes at an economic as well as political price. The Europeans would love to diversify their sources of natural gas. Some people in Gazprom, whose name I'm not going to mention, were laughing at shale gas, saying it's not real. Well, if American shale gas starts hitting European markets, and as a result, the gas price in Europe will go down, and it'll stimulate economic recovery in Europe, This is not a bad thing. It's not bad for the US, and it's not bad for Russia, because Russia can export to Europe other things than natural gas. To conclude and move to the Q&A. The ball today is in Moscow's court. If the tendency of building a quasi-imperial Russian state with Kyrgyzstan and with Armenia and maybe with Tajikistan in the future, and create a tariff barrier around it and use soft power such as television and others. If you look at the Glaziev-Medvedchuk paper, they're talking openly about using intelligence services. And Mr. Putin tasked openly the intelligence services to fight those who are against integration with Russia. So if they go in that direction, I do not see good and easy sailing between US and Russia. If, on the other hand, this 180-year, probably off by a couple of decades, 160-year debate between Eurasianists and Westernizers in Russia resolves or balances, there are tons and tons of things, tens of billions of dollars of business that we can do together. In fact, US and Russian economies are complementary. But the ball is in the Russian court, it is in Mr. Putin's court, and I hope that as a result of rethinking on both sides, we will end up with something more positive than this low point in which we are today. Thank you very much. And now, how much time do you have?
I have to leave at 1.
Okay, so can you stay for another 10 minutes?
Okay, yeah, sorry.
So let's do 10-minute Q&A real quick. Please identify yourself, and as the Colonel said here, make it a question. Timuri. Ambassador Yakubashvili, sorry.
Thank you, Ariel. One suggestion, you have to call it Q&A, and O, because opinion matters.
Short.
Because I'll try now to form my opinion in the form of question. You said the ball is on the Russian side. I think it's not the ball that is on Russian side, but it's initiative that's Russian side. And that's the problematic, because Russians effectively hijacked every single item, twisted them in their benefit, and we don't see any comprehensive US policy toward Russia or that Eurasian region. Whatever you call the reset, I think it's a high time to call it what it was. It was an attempt to inflate Medvedev as a responsible political figure. Everything else was just disguise of this idea. And that idea failed, and nobody wants to recognize that it was all about Medvedev. So if you forget about it, probably you will see the more reality. And the reality is that it's Russia who is in the driving seat. Russia is twisting the human rights issue solely to be issue on LGBT community. Russia is the only one in why they have exclusive rights to talk to not Assad regime, but Alawites and Christian minorities in Syria. Russia is giving the exclusive rights to deal with many other issues as well.
I don't hear a question yet.
Yes, it's coming. So the opinion / question is, what should be the proactive US foreign policy in all areas, in the human rights, in military, in society, economy, and et cetera, and et cetera.
So we have an eminent expert here, Dr. Farkas, and I think that easy question from Ambassador Yakubashvili goes to you first.
Well, I can't speak across the entire relationship because my area of expertise is, of course, in the defense lane. But first, I do have to push back on the notion that this was all about Medvedev. It was clearly a concerted effort to put the relationship on a pragmatic, even keel, and it did succeed. It succeeded in putting us on a new level and we were able to achieve those concrete things that I mentioned already. It is true that we remain stuck with regard to some very important issues, and so to that extent, we can't move forward, and we would like Russia to take some initiative. I think many of the comments that were made by the other panelists about economic opportunity, human rights, many of the comments were very valid, and they are raised by us. And even the Russians on the economic front, they say that they would like to increase cooperation with the United States on the economic front. The thing is that there are certain things that they need to do to make that a real reality. Yeah. But, I think I would say for the administration that we would welcome the engagement of the business community and of others from U.S. society. It shouldn't be something that's driven just by the White House. So I'll just leave it at that.
Okay. Can I demonstrate how Russia wants to build the business ties? A couple of days ago, there was a meeting with Mr. Putin and Mr. Sechin in Vladivostok, and that's on the Pacific. And the subject was construction of offshore rigs and tankers that are necessary to develop oil and gas in Sakhalin and in the Far East. They're going to finish the pipeline, put it on the Russian Pacific coast, and then probably get a gas pipeline. And then the Sakhalin gas is going up. Japanese are going to shut down the nuclear reactors. The Japanese need more gas. So there's a demand for rigs and tankers. Good. So they published this, what I call classic KGB analysis, that those Western companies that get orders to build these tankers and rigs are going to intentionally sabotage it because they're not, friends of Russia. They probably get it wrong that companies in the West are in the business to make money. And if they don't meet the deadlines, they won't be paid or they'll have to pay fines. So if these are enemies of Russia and they won't build these tankers and rigs, we will force them to become partners with the Russian, with one of the, I think, Gazprom affiliates, and build these plants in Russia, in the Far East. There's no discussion of any kind of competition or bidding process. And Mr. Sechin said, this company, they're going to be requested to participate in that. So if this is how this business is going to develop, I would not invest in this business, because if the competition is not there, if it's not transparent, if it's by fiat, this is not a business model that works. It didn't work in the Soviet Union. It didn't work in an autarkic Brazil when Brazil tried to protect its own market. And the fact that it didn't work is the reason why China opened up. So somebody, maybe in the administration, maybe outside of the administration, needs to elucidate how real international business works. It doesn't work by forcing companies to come and become junior partners in joint ventures in the Russian Far East. Let's go to the next question. Lady in green. Yes, Emil. Can you introduce yourself, please?
Hi, my name is Barbara Dello, and thank you.
Are
Russia,
you affiliated with anybody?
no.
Okay.
Russia is a country that has experienced to some degree a breakdown. To what extent is Russia's opposition to the end of the Assad regime due to the fear that chaos or lack of order will ensue in Syria if Assad falls?
I think that this is probably a part or a factor in Russia's analysis. Russia is on the record saying that if Assad falls, radical Islamist Sunni organizations such as Jabhat al-Nusra, which is affiliated with Al-Qaeda, such as the Muslim Brotherhood that our government, for some reason, for the last 5 years, likes, and other extremist Islamic groups may come to dominate Syria and may slaughter the Alawis, the Christians, and the others. So I think this is one of the valid considerations, and I don't know if Dr. Farkas or my colleagues. Yeah, Don?
I would agree with Ariel, but I would add there are several motivations, and on the one about the concern about the spread of Islamic fundamentalism, I think we would agree with the Russians. But there are other factors at play here, one of which, as I mentioned in my remarks, is the international precedent they don't want after Libya or Serbia of Western intervention in regime change. And second, and I think I have to be frank, is frankly personal anti-Americanism, not only from Putin, but other parts of the leadership, which just wants to screw the United States and keep the UN as a fig leaf for U.S. military action, away from an area they traditionally, as Ariel said, looked at as part of their traditional ally with which they have a lot of financial, business, and security ties.
Do you want to say something about this validity of Russian argument that there are no good options in Syria? Maybe Assad is a horrible option, but it's the least bad.
I mean, I think everyone knows that doing nothing isn't going to solve the problem either. So, you know.
And who is doing that?
Oh, I'm sorry, I have to go.
That's your
that's
call.
my call.
I understand. Thank you so much.
I apologize. Thank you very much for your time.
If I could add, the Russians, I believe, rejected a U.S. initiative about a year ago to put the chemical weapons under control, joint control, or international control.
Yeah, the gentleman right in front.
Samar Chatterjee from Safe Foundation. I have to kind of, I guess the only honorable person on the panel is gone, so address this to all the dishonorable panel members.
This is probably not
including
very appropriate use of
myself.
language.
Okay. Now, as we know, that the majority of the Americans, 60%, are against intervention in Syria. And we are talking about human rights. We've seen the last almost more than a decade worth of American human rights record, which is dismal, if not pretty brutal and genocidal. Given that, I don't know how this club is going to be used, because the rest of the world is laughing at that club. So given that, I want to know what United States can offer in this area, either to prevent Russia from whatever they're doing at home or abroad, as well as the Syrian. I mean, how can a genocidal action by United States,
Okay,
when
sir,
there's
sir, this is a
going on?
panel on U.S. Russian relations.
Yes,
And
so
I think
I'm talking about
okay,
U.S. Russian
thank you.
relations
All right,
in
all right.
Syria.
Okay. I think, to say the least, you're jumping to conclusions calling U.S. action genocidal. I'm not going to deign this question with an answer, but if anybody else wants to answer, go ahead. Okay, next question, if any. Probably it's 1:20. We're way over time. So this gentleman, Emil, this gentleman right here. Okay, here we go.
Yes, Sam Wright, U.S. Navy retired. What are the odds that the Assad dynasty will make it to a third generation, as in North Korea?
I'm not going to speculate. I did not bring my crystal ball, and I think that Assad may survive this strike, but at the rate things are going, I would not take out a life insurance policy for that gentleman right now. Okay, we are unfortunately way over, I'm sorry, way over our deadline. and both Steve Bucci and Secretary Farkas left. So I want at this point to thank you all very much for coming and invite you to come here again. And for our viewers on the internet, thank you all for participating, and this will be in the Heritage Archive on the internet for the foreseeable future. Thank you.